Welcome to The Future Unleashed from Lincoln College, Oxford. I'm your host, Helen O'Hara, and joining me today is Jane McAdam, who is Scientia Professor of Law and founding director of the Caldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales, where she leads the Evacuations Research Hub. Professor McAdam publishes widely on international refugee law and forced migration, and has a particular focus on mobility in the context of climate change. Her legal analysis has been adopted by courts, governments and UN bodies, and has been highly influential in the development of international, national and regional policy frameworks. She has been an expert advisor for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration and the World Bank. In 2021, she was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to international refugee law, particularly in regards to climate change and the displacement of people. Today we are in Lincoln's Middle Common Room, otherwise known as the MCR. This is the epicentre of graduate life in the college, a welcoming and vibrant social space for around 300 graduate students. Lincoln's MCR is actually the oldest in Oxford. It was originally founded in 1958. It was moved here in 2014 into the newly built Barrow Foundation building. The MCR was recently renamed the Marquise de Amudio Room to honour the founder of the Barrow Foundation, who generously supported both the building and the eponymous scholarship scheme. That brings 7 graduates each year from Swiss universities to study at Lincoln. The shields on the chimney overmantel are carved from oak, and they reference Switzerland and its cantons, Liechtenstein, Oxford University and Lincoln College. They commemorate the links between Oxford and the Barrow Foundation Scholarships work. So, Professor, welcome back to Lincoln.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's wonderful to be back here in person.
So, in the broadest sense, your research centres on international refugee law and issues, around that. So how did you get into that area?
Well, when I was studying law back in Australia, towards the end of my degree, we had the opportunity to do electives. And for me, international law, human rights law were the areas of particular interest. Now, this was at a time when one of the key human rights challenges in Australia was the treatment of people seeking asylum and refugees, and it's a point at which Australia's policies started to really harden. So that became an area of interest for me academically. A year after graduating, I had the opportunity to work with a judge in the Federal Court of Australia, and many of the cases he had were failed asylum claims. And listening to the testimony of some of those people who were representing themselves in court kind of fortified, I think, my interest in this area as an area of great human rights need and abuses in some cases. And I then applied to Oxford, to Lincoln, to do my doctorate, and came here to study with the world's leading scholar in that area, Professor Guy Goodwin-Gill.
So for most of the last, I think, about 18 years, your focus has been on people moving away from their homes because of the impacts of climate change, natural disasters, that kind of thing. So what makes that in particular such a key issue for you?
When I started this work, it was very much a niche area, but it was becoming increasingly apparent that the impacts of climate change and disasters were triggering considerable human movement. Now, most of that is within countries, not across international borders. But I did start to wonder, well, what happens if somebody does seek international protection in another country? Would existing legal frameworks, the refugee law framework, for example, be able to offer such a person protection? Where are the gaps? Where aren't there gaps? We really need to tackle this, and no one had really done it at that point. It coincided, though, with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report, where they had a particular focus on this issue as well. And so a lot of social scientists at that time became interested in looking at how do climate change impacts and disasters intersect with other drivers of movement, conflict, human rights violations, persecution.
Now that sort of brings us to this question of, climate refugee as a term, because it is sometimes used in the media, but it isn't maybe settled as a term, let's say. There's a lot of debate around that. So is it a useful shorthand, or is it a little bit too simplistic?
Well, I mean, as a matter of law, it's not a term of art, for example, and there are a number of problems with it legally, but I think as a shorthand term, it does encapsulate for people very quickly what we're talking about. So it's people who are having to move because the impacts of climate change are making their environment unsustainable, perhaps impacting on livelihoods. People can't grow crops anymore, can't sustain a living. But I mean, there are a number of issues that mean the refugee label is sometimes problematic, not least the fact that many people to whom it's ascribed, for example, people in small Pacific Island countries, on the whole strongly reject it.
Right.
Partly that's because, as a refugee lawyer, I find this difficult to stomach, but they say we're not victims like refugees are, we are people with agency and something to contribute. Now, I think refugees are exactly the same, but I think the point is that they see internationally the dire need of many people who are seeking asylum and think we just don't want to be put in that situation. So yes, I mean, legally the challenges are the fact that as a matter of law, firstly, you need to be a refugee, you have to have crossed an international border. And here, most people at this stage, at least, are moving within their own country. You have to show that you have a well-founded fear of being persecuted, which normally involves some sort of human agency. And that persecution needs to be for reasons of race, religion, political opinion, membership of a particular social group. Putting all those things together can make it challenging. But that said, in the last decade or so, we've come to a much more nuanced understanding about how the impacts of climate change intersect with existing forms of persecution. They can amplify the human rights challenges that people are facing. They can put people in a very difficult predicament and cumulatively can make existing persecution worse or transform kind of lower level problems into something that become persecution.
So how does that multiplication factor work? Is that a matter of, let's say a country doesn't have enough resources in the first place, so then they sort of make it more difficult for the minority group maybe to access those?
Exactly, that would be one example. There have been some interesting cases that are sort of peripheral in a way. So there was an interesting one in New Zealand where a woman in Myanmar had been a humanitarian worker in the aftermath of Cyclone Nargis. As a result, she was persecuted on account of that being perceived as a political opinion. And so she was granted refugee status in New Zealand. Now, climate change wasn't the reason, but that's a case where it's kind of got a role to play. And increasingly we're seeing cases being brought in different jurisdictions where climate, drought, impacts of drought are intersecting with a situation of conflict. So it's very interesting to see how it's developing.
So the weather isn't persecuting anyone for their identity, but it is having an unequal effect and an effect of magnifying inequalities that already exist.
That's right, and I think, often we talk about disasters. Sometimes people refer to natural disasters, but in fact, hazards are natural. Disasters mean that they've sort of social, economic circumstances and political circumstances have transformed them into something where people's coping capacity is exceeded. And so I think that's also where understanding disasters as something that can have a kind of political element to them, where a government can withhold resources or favour different groups, all of that becomes part of the framework for analysis here.
So the concept that climate change might make parts of the world unlivable, it feels obvious now, sadly, but I think it was a little bit less so maybe when you started work on that. So did people take a lot of convincing initially that this was something they needed to think about, they needed to start acting on? Some
people certainly did. And I mean, when I first started working on this, it was about 2006-07, and it was at a point where there was a lot of scepticism about whether climate change was even a thing. And I recall chatting to one man who expressed amazement that the university would permit me to undertake research on something so hypothetical. And other people said to me, wow, you must really want to be hated. I mean, you're studying refugees, now you're adding climate change into the mix, are you crazy? So yes, it did take some convincing. But I think also what was in a way helpful, I mean, it sounds awful to say it was helpful, but disasters were and are of course still happening, and I think they're very tangible, people can see those. So whether or not one factors climate change in terms of amplifying their severity or frequency, the fact they're there can kind of stop that is climate change real conversation in its tracks, and instead say, well, this is happening, what should we do? And in fact, that, I think, globally as well, became quite a helpful framing point. So in 2012, there was an intergovernmental initiative established by Norway and Switzerland called the Nansen Initiative on Disaster-Induced Cross-Border Displacement. Not the catchiest title. And I think initially climate change was going to be part of the title as well, but there was political opposition from a couple, well, we won't name the countries, but from some countries. But in fact, I think by removing that, obviously climate change was still part of what we were looking at, but it enabled a focus to really begin. And that initiative 3 years later was transformed into something that still exists called the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And the work that those two organisations have, or initiatives have achieved, is nothing short of transformational, I think.
That's a really good step then. But there is a danger of, we're thinking about the future here. Moving forward, there is the danger that some particularly low-lying countries might essentially vanish from the map. That is a danger if sort of sea levels rise. And then that poses the question of, do those people become stateless? Some of the low-lying Pacific countries that you mentioned could reach that point theoretically. So is that something that's on people's minds? What is the response to that issue?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Look, the Pacific Island governments themselves frame climate change as an existential threat. But this notion of, they're very resistant to the idea that there's somehow inevitability that countries will cease to exist. And again, this is where, as a matter of international law, it's been a fascinating kind of question that has been taken up by a committee I've been involved with for the last 12 years. We've just concluded our tenure. It's a committee of the International Law Association, but also the UN has an International Law Commission, and they're currently seized this topic too. And I think what's become relatively clear is that statelessness as a kind of legal, or lack of a status if you like, is unlikely to arise because of disappearing territory per se. It's actually more likely to come about when people move abroad and their own government's citizenship laws don't allow them to pass down nationality to their children, or can withdraw nationality if people have lived overseas for a certain length of time. And that's very important because that's something that governments can kind of focus their attention on now. And when it comes to the question of statehood itself, if territory starts to be subsumed by rising sea levels, I think what's been very significant is that, again, countries in the Pacific have really been on the front foot here, and last year adopted a declaration where they state very clearly why, as a matter of international law, territory, statehood doesn't disappear if the size of territory starts to decline. And in the UN Sixth Committee debates, quite a lot of governments are supporting that view that statehood continues, which is very important, I think, to kind of emphasise here.
So the land might be eroded, but not the statehood, essentially.
That's right. And I think the other interesting factor that I've I guess coming from the mobility perspective, is that long before territory disappears, people are going to need to move. So far, I think everyone's attention's been on the territory disappearing and then what happens. But what I've been saying is, well, if people migrate, well, eventually if you have a whole population living somewhere else, that's the kind of sign of statehood that may go. But perhaps even more, or equally importantly, your voting base may move. So I think this is where attention now needs to be focused on, if people are moving, then how do you ensure that they can retain dual citizenship, or have dual citizenship, but also retain voting rights? And it's a really live issue at the moment because Australia is just has just concluded a treaty with Tuvalu. It's a small island country of around 10,000 people, and part of that is to offer people in Tuvalu a special mobility pathway to Australia, which will allow up to 280 people a year to move to Australia, to have instant access to a whole range of rights, but also the entitlement eventually to become Australian citizens. And at the moment, Tuvalu doesn't permit people to vote from abroad. So I think this is something that they will have to be considering now as well, what they're going to do here.
So that's fascinating. So theoretically, you could end up with a government entirely of diaspora, like a state that entirely exists.
You might.
Elsewhere.
And I mean, I guess then the question is, well, what functions can that
Yeah.
government in reality perform? But yeah, I mean, they're fascinating intellectual questions, but they're actually raising extremely practical questions at this very moment.
And of course, look, this isn't just about sea levels. This is also about, we've seen world record heat levels this summer. We've seen, crops failing in parts of the world. We've seen places where rising temperatures threaten livability, certainly threaten farming and agriculture and sustenance. So are we starting to see people moving for those reasons beyond their own borders? And how much of an issue will that be if those temperatures continue to rise?
Yes, I mean, I think that's true. This isn't just a future issue. There are people on the move right now. One of the challenges is, where are people going? Because we don't have visa categories to count people crossing borders for these reasons. So internally we know that, and this has been a trend for more than a decade now, every year there are well more than half of internal displacement is on account of disasters compared to conflict, which I think is probably the opposite of what most people would expect it to be. How many of those people are crossing borders, as I say, is unclear. But, certainly in some parts of the world, you're exactly right, that with that heat, people cannot grow crops, they cannot sustain a livelihood. In regions like Africa, for example, there are free movement arrangements that do, in some cases, enable people to move more freely. You could look at Europe as well as a region where that's the case. In other parts of the world, there are no such agreements. And so then it does come down to either people moving of their own volition, trying to seek protection, whether under refugee law or under human rights law as well. And human rights law requires governments not to send people back to a place where they face a real risk to their life or a real risk of inhuman or degrading treatment. And I think it's possible to argue that at some point those conditions absolutely can be characterised as either or both of those things.
I mean, that's getting into the definition, isn't it, of refugees, and it does raise questions of how refugee law, as it currently stands, can cope with some of the pressures that are potentially coming in the next few decades. So, are we going to have to define refugee differently? Are we going to have to change that sort of legal definition, or, who's looking at that? Who's deciding on these questions?
Quite a lot of people are looking at it
you,
now.
I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, at this very moment, with colleagues from the UK and the US, and also supported by UNHCR, the refugee agency, we're developing guidance for decision makers and lawyers, I suppose, as well, to show how existing refugee law and human rights law frameworks can be utilised in these cases. Because I think historically there was a tendency for decision makers to see, drought or flood, and immediately think that can't be refugee law, whereas what we're saying is, well, it could be. Refugee law is not going to help everyone by any stretch of the imagination, and perhaps nor should it. There should be more proactive policies, migration with dignity, enabling people to move more of their own volition. But equally, we shouldn't just shut refugee law down as an option. And as I was mentioning, human rights law also contains these protections. That's actually what my doctorate was about. How do you utilise these kind of, non-refoulement is the legal term, but non-return to a real risk of inhuman or degrading treatment or arbitrary deprivation of life. And I think that's where, in the emerging jurisprudence, we're also seeing some of the sort of some greater traction. So a couple of years ago, there was a matter that ended up before the UN Human Rights Committee, and although it can't look at refugee law, it did say that as a matter of principle, the impacts of climate change may well mean that states have an obligation not to send people back because their lives would be threatened. So, refugee law alone is not going to be the answer. As a matter of, pragmatism, there is absolutely no political appetite at the moment among governments to change the definition to be more, encompass more people than it does. But equally, there are ways, as there have been ever since it was created in 1951. You mentioned gender before. We now can absolutely see that gender can be a ground for persecution. But these things have been interpreted in because refugee law and human rights law are kind of living, dynamic instruments, and their interpretation will evolve over time.
I want to ask a bit about sort of these individual countries and individual laws, because there are these international questions of human rights law, but it also does come down, or will come down in a lot of cases, to individual countries' immigration laws and how they interpret those locally, won't it?
Yes, and I mean, different countries have kind of transposed international refugee law and human rights law into their national law in different ways. So some countries have, for instance, incorporated gender specifically into as one of the grounds for granting refugee status, persecution on account of gender, whereas others have sought to, to the extent they possibly can, restrict. And part of that too is just trying to, as we've seen in the UK and Australia, really just trying to limit access to territory in the first place so as not to enliven the law at all. But I think, immigration law is bigger than refugee law, and so I think what we need here is a kind of toolkit of responses. So, on the one hand, we need to ensure that to the extent people want to remain in their homes, that they can be enabled to do that, and that's overarching mitigation, but also climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Then it's a question of, well, if people are displaced, then where does protection element come in? But then how can standard migration law be utilised to assist more people to move? And it could be that you create some sort of new category, arguably this Australia Tuvalu arrangement, which is very much framed in the context of climate change. It's a new visa that will be created. Quite what it's called, I'm not sure. But you could create new mobility visas, but equally you could have sort of concessions for people coming from regions particularly affected by climate change. And then there's, in extreme cases, planned relocations. Now, they already are happening. The Pacific, again, is leading the way with very detailed guidance and operational practices and so on. But to date, those relocations have been within countries, not across borders, and I think they're challenging enough. They become incredibly fraught once you try to move, communities across international borders.
Well, that fraught area, I guess, is one I want to get into, because it feels like there's been a lot of flashpoints, issues around immigration, certainly here in the UK, in the US, I think in a lot of Europe, I know in Australia as well. It's been the centre of political conflict, the question of what to do with refugees, how much immigration to allow. How do we steer a course through that? How do we, find a solution for the people most affected by climate change, in the countries, let's be honest, most responsible for climate change?
Well, I think what we have to recognise first and foremost is that people have always been on the move. This is not a new phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that's going to continue. If you look at Australia, it's a multicultural country. Most people have, it's very mobile. People have come and gone. And I think also if we look there at the contributions refugees have made over the last century, it's absolutely not remarkable. It's been incredibly enriching for our society, whether that be socially, culturally, or economically. And I think sometimes politicians and policymakers find it easier just to tap into sort of scapegoating arguments, and everything's someone else's fault, and migrants and refugees are very easy targets for that. And I think that's where the political rhetoric, narrative, as well as, of course, policies need to move. And I think sometimes, for the general public, if people are informed, then they will come to understand that this is it's not a black and white issue, it's very complex. If they reflect upon their own family histories too, it starts to become something that you realise, this is not something that's, this is part of our social fabric, people moving. And I think we can be both pragmatic and principled in our responses. At the Caldor Centre, where I work, we developed a set of principles, one on climate mobility, but another on Australian refugee policy, to show precisely by drawing on comparative practices, but also on Australia's own past, how we could do things differently. And I think highlighting those positive examples is a very important thing to do.
I think all of those countries that I mentioned are pretty much, melting pots, or aim to be melting pots. Maybe mosaic is more accurate, but it is about having as many people as possible doing as well as they can, I guess.
That's right.
So of course, like, one of the ways to sort of change is maybe too strong a word, but clarify internal laws in some countries that may be resistant to admitting refugees, or dealing with some of these issues, is to just bring legal cases and try and clarify what the law says and try and maybe push it in a more open direction. Is that a sort of solution? Can that help with some of these problems?
Yeah, I mean, strategic litigation can be very important. The challenge is getting the right case, because if you don't have the right case, you could actually set things back a good decade or two. So it's waiting for the right factual scenario that raises the kind of legal questions that you want to look at. But the UN Human Rights Committee case that I mentioned before sprang from New Zealand. It was a man from the small island Pacific country of Kiribati who claimed that if he were forced to go back, among other things, he would suffer because of the adverse consequences of climate change. And although on the facts of that case he was unsuccessful, that ultimately what the Human Rights Committee said about climate change can be could give rise to this sort of non-return obligation. That built upon what the New Zealand tribunal and courts had also said. And I think that's become a really key legal statement to be able to point to, notwithstanding the fact academics and others had been saying those things. To have a body like the UN Human Rights Committee to cite is really helpful. And colleagues have been doing studies of cases emerging in Austria and Sweden and Italy and elsewhere. And while it's still quite nascent, there's some really interesting, there are some very interesting ideas emerging. So it's a bit of a watch this space, I think.
It feels like judges are trying a little bit not to make bad law in this area, because they do say, there's an old legal saying, isn't there, bad cases make bad law? But I feel like they're actively trying, maybe, at least in some cases, not to set up barriers for the future. Even if the particular case doesn't win, they're still saying maybe in future it could.
Well, and there was a trio of cases recently about involving climate change and human rights in the European Court of Human Rights. The International Court of Justice currently has before it, or is going to deliver at some point, an advisory opinion looking at the impacts of climate change in part on human rights. Regional bodies are also seized with these questions. Now, the extent to which the displacement angle comes in remains to be seen, but I think it's not that this is going to go away. And I think, if governments aren't going to develop policies here, then you kind of start to see this dance happening between the courts sometimes and national policymakers in terms of where is this going to go. I mean, I would say at the same time that particularly the European Court of Human Rights has also been quite careful, I suppose, not to open the floodgates. And we've seen that in the so-called health cases where people have resisted removal from the UK, very often actually, or Europe on the basis that they can't receive adequate health care in their home country. And it's a really high threshold to be able to make a successful claim on that basis. So, climate change cases could potentially fall into that kind of analysis. But again, this is why we're writing the guidance, to try and clarify what best practice might look like.
Now, you've mentioned several times that the Pacific nations are kind of leading the way on a lot of this, that they're already grappling with a lot of these issues. So how are some of the ways that they have sort of responded to this, sort of with kind of, I guess, cross-Pacific, initiatives?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I was called upon to provide an initial draft of what became the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility, and that was adopted by the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum in November 2023. Now, this is it's not a legal instrument, it's not a treaty, but it's a political declaration, if you like, or a bit more than a declaration, but really trying to set down some general principles, but also some commitments, political commitments of governments in that region, to find ways to enable people to remain in their homes when that's what they want to do, but how they might cooperate in order to support migration with dignity as a form of adaptation, to support people who find themselves displaced. What happens when people are evacuated, for example, because that can hopefully save lives but often lead to protracted displacement. Again, the planned relocation issue, but then these sort of broad intersecting issues about human rights, safeguarding identity and cultural heritage. And these are very big questions. For Pacific Islanders, the land is part of them and they are part of the land. So it's not just a matter of, oh, that's fine, I'll move. Your whole identity is bound up with where you're from. And it's also why it's such a sensitive issue in the Pacific. There are some people who don't want to even contemplate the fact that they might have to move, notwithstanding the fact it's a highly mobile region. The idea that you might leave permanently is very, very difficult to contemplate. And then occasionally you'll hear people saying, I don't know why we're even talking about staying, because that's not going to be possible. So there's a huge spectrum there of perspectives, and it varies across. The Pacific is a highly diverse region, and every country will take at times a different view. So it's not as simple as saying we're all affected, this is what we're going to do. And also when you add Australia and New Zealand into the mix as part of the Pacific, there's a bit of a different dynamic there as well.
But at least the conversation is very much ongoing. Does that kind of go back to the displacements for the nuclear tests in the 50s and that kind of thing? Because I know some of those populations have never been able to return home, so there must be a lot of issues around that.
That's right, and that's also why it's quite sensitive. And I've looked, for example, at some planned relocations. There's only been a handful that occurred across international borders. And there are two, for example, one that took place from what is today Tuvalu, another that took place from what is today Kiribati, two countries very much affected by climate change. Both those communities moved to Fiji. Now, at the time, this was during the colonial period, they bought islands that were in Fiji and moved the communities there. And there are ongoing issues to this day about how unjust some of that was. In one case, there was phosphate mining that had been happening. Then, because of the Second World War, that community had been moved, and then they were told by the colonial administration that it was ruined, they couldn't possibly go back, and so they went to this island in Fiji. Phosphate mining then resumed, and as I say, there's a huge sense of injustice today about what has happened. And notwithstanding some very creative and interesting constitutional arrangements that were made in Kiribati, so that this population still has a right of representation back there in Parliament. People can take up citizenship. There's all sorts of safeguards that exist. They're not enough to kind of fix this issue, and that's why I said before, planned relocations are particularly fraught. And I think it's naive if we think that you can simply uproot a population and move them somewhere else. My own country has a past of doing that, and as I say, it's intergenerational and it doesn't go away.
So looking a little bit further into the future, I mean, the problem seems to be borders. Like, is it genuinely, do we get past a place where borders are quite so much of a barrier? Is the answer to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more mobile overall?
It would be an answer. And I mean, again, we can look at what certain regions have done with free movement arrangements. But the realpolitik is such that I can't see countries saying, that's fine, we'll just relax border restrictions. But we only need to look at how stringent they are becoming in terms of what they are doing to the rights people might have. As I said earlier on, blocking access to territory is the way that countries are trying to ensure that refugee law never has to be activated, because if people can't get there in the first place, then it doesn't matter what your legal obligations are. And as we've seen in the UK, the constant litigation to fight that, and then politically what's happened as a result. That's the kind of age-old question, is if you abolish borders, then what will happen? I don't see that happening necessarily, but I do think that we will continue to have these conversations about how do you facilitate mobility. And by that I mean something, it doesn't necessarily mean you move from point A to point B and that's it. Mobility is something that can be more circular than that, and the arrangement that Australia and Tuvalu are creating, I suspect, will be very much like that people will know that Australia can be a safety net, but that they will be able to return home when they want to.
Okay, so a question we're asking everybody. How would you describe Lincoln in 3 words?
This is really challenging because so many words come to mind. But I suppose the very first word that came into my head was intimate. And I suppose that builds on this notion that Lincoln is a small and friendly and welcoming college. And certainly I found it to be that way when I was here. It was a very vibrant community, but still quite a small one. So, even though you have the SCR, the MCR and the JCR, there was a lot of interaction between them, and also I think a kind of culture of that was fostered here that we are all part of one community. The second word would be inclusive, and I mean that kind of relates to the first, but I felt very much that Lincoln sought to be quite, certainly in the MCR, quite multicultural, embracing people from all over the world, and everyone was made to feel welcome. But beyond that, I think Lincoln has a long and proud tradition of its outreach policies and enabling people to come to Oxford who once upon a time would never have had that chance, and that's really important to me. And I think Lincoln has done very well there. And the final word is enabling. And I found Lincoln really I couldn't have had greater support and encouragement to do things, whether that be teaching within the college, tutoring within the college, being brought into seminars that were offered, and listening, the wonderful intellectual environment that is here, but really trying to foster individual interests and talent and enabling people to flourish.
In this series, we're talking about the future. So what would you say to the students at Lincoln today who are kind of the stewards of that future?
I think I would say enjoy your time here, really relish the opportunities that you have. And obviously many of those opportunities are scholarly ones, intellectual pursuits with the most amazing tutors and lecturers. But beyond that, I think it is really kind of embracing the community that is here, the networks that you build, and I don't mean that in an awful sense of networking, but rather the people that you will meet who will hopefully remain friends throughout your life, and kind of carrying that sense of collegiality with you into the pursuits that you ultimately pursue, the activities and jobs that you ultimately pursue.
Jane McAdam, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.